even when we compare to emerging markets. South African debt levels are higher than that of what we see in other emerging markets. This offers a risk.
Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana has only been on the job a few months, and his first medium-term budget policy statement was delayed by a week. That will be taking place this Thursday. Joining me to discuss the potential ramifications of the mini-budget is our resident economic analyst at the CRA, Bheki Mahlobo. Bheki, what are you anticipating from Thursday's statement?
Hi, David. So some of the overview thoughts that I have going into the Thursday budget speech is firstly, looking at the fiscal situation in the country, the trend line largely. This is Enoch's first budget speech, and Enoch does not particularly have experience working within the National Treasury. One of the points marked in the February budget speech was the increase in debt levels in the country. If you recall, in 2019 and as compared to 2020, we added about 20% to our debt levels in the country. That's massive. Our expenditure levels were sitting at 41 as a proportion of GDP, and revenue collection was sitting at 27. Now that 41% is projected to climb down a little bit to in the 30 levels. That's because of firstly, last year's contraction and the expected recovery in GDP performance and this year's GDP performance. That'll prove to be a challenge for Mr. Enoch Godongwana in terms of reining in expenditure while trying to raise in revenue. That's a point that I'm actually going to have a look. That's another point that I'm going to have to look at in his budget speech this Thursday.
Enjoying this analysis? Click here to sign up for our 30-day free trial for more content from the CIA.
All right. Well, I think many analysts such as yourself will be looking at the deficit. There is some silver lining with the commodities boom that we've been experiencing that's helped drive South African minerals exports and has kind of bought a bit of time for the Treasury. But these things are cyclical, and we're likely to see that turning potentially against us, and no real sign of any appetite for curtailing expenditure from the government. So what is your prediction for the year ahead in the run-up to next February's budget? How are we going to see revenues performing in this new context?
Yeah, so the commodity rally has had a positive impact in terms of revenue collection. It has led to a trade account surplus when South Africa exports. South Africa's exports are predominantly made up of commodities. So whenever we see a commodity rally, that results in government revenue improving. Certain estimates have this around in the range of 100 to 160 billion, above what was projected in the February budget. As you mentioned, however, this is largely cyclical. It's the short term and does not mean much in terms of actually improving revenue collection by the National Treasury. Now, what I suspect will then come forth is introduction of more government expenditure programs, in fact, expensive ones with low growth levels in the country. And with this, I'm referring to the Universal Basic Income grant. There's been much talk of this throughout the year, and this is going to be a point of concern for the National Treasury, as this will lead to an increase in government expenditure and unfortunately an increase in debt levels in the country. This is something that the country cannot afford to make at this moment with such low growth levels. And this is something else that the South African Reserve Governor, Lesetja Kganyago, also flagged, that the South African government at the moment must not be fooled by the commodity rally that we're currently witnessing to assume that it has long-term financing for its much expensive government programs in the future. So that's what I expect in the February budget of next year. I don't expect them to announce such major expenditure programs in the update of this medium-term budget speech, but I expect him to have some level to announce some forms of government expenditure programs in February next year.
And Bheki, you mentioned our debt levels, which have been going up considerably, particularly over the last few years and with COVID in particular. What do you expect the finance minister to reveal about our debt levels in South Africa?
So due to the rebasing of the South African economy, I expect that debt levels will be revised to below 80%. If you recall, debt levels in February budget were roughly in the 80% levels, and then stats that say rebase South African GDP. So that's what I expect will come with debt levels. However, what's important, David, is the trend line of debt levels in the country, which is unfortunately in an upward trajectory, even when we compare to emerging markets. South African debt levels are higher than that of what we see in other emerging markets. This offers a risk. Same level when you, as a consumer, David, when you have high levels of debt levels, that's a risk that banks see in your profile. It's the same thing with the national government. And that's exactly what we've been seeing. We've been seeing an increase in debt servicing costs to the point where it's the second most expensive expenditure item in the budget, which now currently stands at about 260 billion. That's more than what we spend on healthcare, as well as more than what we spend on policing, as well as defense in the country. And with that, unfortunately, it means that we have less to spend on other items, such as maybe perhaps looking at more expenditure towards education, as well as that of healthcare. But of course, just throwing money towards these items does not really amount to much in terms of the output. What is needed is actual reforms in these sectors that I've just mentioned.
Yeah, and we've just concluded the local government elections, and many municipalities around the country are in a state of financial disarray. And Mr. Godongwana's predecessor, Tito Mboweni, he refused to bail out some of these failing municipalities. I think all eyes will be on the new finance minister to see if he will also hold the line there.
David, another point that I'd like to make is the pressure coming from trade unions. The trade unions this week have made the point that the finance minister should implement stimulus measures in order to relieve the pressure that unemployed people in the country currently face. And the finance minister, the current now finance minister, has a union background.
All right, Bheki. Well, one of the key features of the medium-term budget policy statement is a revision of the growth estimates from National Treasury. Do you think that Mr. Godongwana is going to be revealing anything new there in terms of growth? Because South Africa's growth has been anemic for many years. And as we at the CRA have often argued, Treasury estimates tend to be a bit on the over-optimistic side. What are some of your thoughts on Treasury's projected growth estimates?
Yeah, so if you recall, David, Tito Mboweni actually put the lowest GDP forecast figure for 2023 at 1.6%. Before that, as you mentioned, GDP figures by the National Treasury tended to be incorrect by a margin of 50%. It would be quite interesting to have a look at what revisions Enoch Godongwana would have on GDP figures. But it was a smoking gun with what Tito Mboweni revealed with his GDP forecast of 1.6%. And the reason being is that we believe that Tito Mboweni actually didn't see reforms being implemented in the short term in South Africa. And that's exactly why he put such a low GDP figure ever put by a national treasury minister on paper.
And do you expect a whole raft of reform announcements to be made by Mr. Godongwana in Thursday's speech?
No, David, a lot of analysts have actually been anticipating that Enoch Godongwana will mention fundamental reforms in the South African economy. I do not expect this to be the case. I expect him to actually fidget around the edges, mention such things such as spectrum release, as well as reducing the red tape that businesses face on a daily basis. Now, of course, that is definitely needed, and that's definitely aspects that the South African government needs to have a look at. But he won't mention any fundamental reforms, such as the reduction in SOE debt, as well as any form of reforms that would see the country emulate the growth that we see in other emerging markets.
Bheki Mahlobo, thank you very much. Bheki and I will be hosting a webinar this Friday, the 12th of November at 10 a.m. Please do join us if you are a CRA client. And if you're not a CRA client, you can join us via our 30-day free trial. There's a link in the description below. My name is Ansara. Until next time, take care.